In the very first episode of the World Literature Podcast, I discussed Ruth Ozeki's novel A Tale for the Time Being with Dr. Jareen Tan from City University of Hong Kong. And in that conversation, Jareen mentioned she'd actually taught the novel in a number of different places. And I expressed the fact that I was a little bit jealous that she'd got to teach it, as I hadn't at that point. And she also told me how, when she'd been in Tokyo, she'd gone to some of the places mentioned in the novel, including maid cafes and love hotels. Well, I was fortunate enough to be invited to Tsurumi University, which is it's actually just in Yokohama, between Tokyo and Yokohama, by Professor Motoko Sugano, who's a professor there. And during that visit, I both taught A Tale for the Time Being in an undergraduate class, in a kind of one-off class, and also gave a research presentation to other academics that's also attended by some students. So I actually got to teach and discuss A Tale for a Time Being in Japan, which was a great pleasure to do. So I didn't go to any maid cafes or love hotels, hand on heart, but I did think it would be a good opportunity to reflect on my experiences of discussing the novel in Japan and some of my other thinking about it. So this is an extra probably final section, which is kind of a coda, let's say, to my discussion with Jareen from a while back. So I do hope you enjoy it. Obviously, if you haven't listened to those three sections where I discussed the novel with Jareen Tan, I'd suggest you do that first before coming to this one. Anyway, I hope you enjoy my reflections on teaching and talking about A Tale for a Time Being in Japan. As I mentioned a moment ago, the context for this episode is that I was invited to Tsurumi University by Professor Motoko Sugano. So first of all, I would like to thank her and the students and other faculty at Tsurumi for their very warm hospitality, their generosity, and for making me feel very welcome on that visit. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about A Tale for the Time Being in the context of this visit, which involved, I guess, two main events, whereas I did a number of things. For example, I visited a junior high school that's affiliated to the university. The university is also connected to a Zen monastery, which is a nice connection to the Zen Buddhism in the novel. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I attended some other student activities. So, for example, I listened, you can see the photo here, I listened to some student presentations on Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara in the Sun, which Motoko had been teaching them. But I'll talk about A Tale for the Time Being, where there were really two events while I was there that were related to this novel. So the first was an undergraduate teaching activity, which is a kind of one-off activity where I got to talk about A Tale for the Time Being with the students. And then I also gave a research presentation to faculty. Also some students were there as well. So I'll talk about each of those in turn and use them just to reflect on some aspects of the novel. So firstly, as I mentioned, I was invited to teach sections of the novel to undergraduates, and it was actually quite a large group. I think there were about 80 in the room, and some of the Japanese faculty were there to help out as well. And the context was students hadn't read the novel. It's not an assigned text on their course. So it was more in the spirit of introducing it and using quite short sections for reading activities, partly to improve their English as much as, as a literary class. Although, of course, I do hope it interests them enough to read it in full. And so I had to focus on, a few short sections from the novel. And I wanted to give the class some kind of focus. So I focused on the idea of translation because, of course, in the novel, a lot of words remain in Japanese, either in Japanese script, which itself is a mixture of kanji, which are the characters, and then the two phonetic alphabets, hiragana and katakana. Some of them are translated phonetically into the Roman alphabet, but still left it's a Japanese word that we can then sound out. And then Ruth, the character Ruth, who seems to be this kind of persona for Ruth Ozeki, then explains some of these and does some of the translation for us in the footnotes she provides within the novel. So clearly, translation is foregrounded, and it's something that our attention is drawn to. And I was asking students to think about, well, what's the kind of rationale between leaving some things untranslated? And we thought of various examples, and you might think of something like, the word kimono, of course, is a Japanese word. And I think most of us are probably familiar with a kimono. And if I say that word, you can picture what it looks like. But imagine we were just trying to translate that into English. How would you translate it? Japanese style dress, maybe? But if you don't know what one already looks like, that doesn't really capture kimono. When I say the word kimono, you think of a kimono. And if you already know what it looks like, do you really need the translation? So, the point is some things are not fully translatable. Actually, the original term, it's only that really fully captures the thing. So that was, the idea of untranslatability, or the idea that things can't fully be translated and therefore are maybe best left in the original language, was one aspect of that class. Another aspect was that translation works in both directions. So there's a section where Now is talking to Jiko and talking about meditation as a superpower, which is rendered as that sort of superpower, not spelt superpower as we would in English. So, of course, we're reminded that the two are actually speaking in Japanese and that we're reading something that's translated. But then we have an English import word which they are using within a Japanese conversation. So translation is working in different directions here. There's also a reference in the Maid Cafe to some Americans eating omu rice, which is omelette over rice. Here's a picture. I felt obliged to order one. It was very good. So this is what omu rice looks like, which of course is a compound between omelette and rice, both of which are English words. Or actually, omelette is originally French. So again, we have another language coming in. But put together in a compound that we never use in English. So again, there's a kind of mixture going on here, and translation working in a number of directions. The final thing we looked at was, I think the novel is also thinking about translation, not in terms of just language to language, but in terms of medium to medium. So there's a nice section where Ruth is describing her relationship with Oliver, and particularly the early days where they're long distance. And she says, he's a sort of ecological activist artist. And she describes how he was sending her these messages, how he translated the wild Pacific Rim into pixels, So this idea that taking one thing, the Pacific Rim ecosystem, which is vast, probably incomprehensible to a non-expert, and translating that both technologically and poetically into a format that that Ruth can understand, as part of their relationship and part of the mutual understanding they arrive at. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes there's a sense that we always lose something with translation, or some things aren't fully translatable. Yeah, I think also in the novel there's a sense that translation can almost elevate the subject matter. And certainly that's present in that description of their relationship. I also talked about Tale for the time being as part of a research presentation. And actually in that presentation I talked about 3 novels. This is part of my general research on transcultural fiction. So I have a book project in its early stages on contemporary transcultural fiction, with the subtitle Dialogue in Tension. And my basic argument is that I think a lot of contemporary fiction, and particularly fiction that's sort of bridging 2 or more cultures, recognizes that in one sense there's no alternative to dialogue as a means of trying to understand each other across cultural boundaries, as a way of trying to build a more harmonious and understanding world. But I think what's also the case is there's a real skepticism, even a suspicion towards dialogue in a lot of contemporary transcultural fiction. I'm talking about a lot of different novels here, so don't want to overgeneralize, but I think there's certainly skepticism towards the efficacy of dialogue, the idea that simply having dialogue will necessarily result in understanding. And in more extreme cases, as I said, a suspicion towards dialogue. I can think of a number of texts where language is actually figured as kind of harmful or toxic. So, there are many, many novels I could talk about that we could call transcultural. I chose 3 with some relationship to Japan, which were Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant, which is actually one of his novels that's very much not directly about Japan. It's about Dark Ages Britain. There is this weird echo of Japan in that book, which is not directly about Japan, but maybe if you know what I'm talking about, let me know in the comments. It's very subtle. Also, Camilla Shamsi's Burnt Shadows, which begins in Nagasaki with the atomic attack, and Ezeki's A Tale for the Time Being. And in the section on A Tale for the Time Being, I focused a little bit on the role of silence, and this relates to the passages on Zen meditation. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a close relationship between Tsurumi University and a major Buddhist temple called Sojiji. In fact, Sojiji is a very old temple, although it wasn't always in this location. It's moved for various reasons, primarily to be closer to the new urban centre. So that's been there for a long time. And actually, as part of my visit, I was lucky enough to be given a tour of the temple, which is very beautiful. I was laughing because in Ishiguro's first novel, A Pale View of Hills, and that's a little clue to the question I just asked, by the way, it describes a Japanese woman who moves to England, and she sort of, at one point, she says, it looked so much like England, like I expected England to be. So it's this weird moment where she sort of affirms her own, maybe not quite a stereotype, but a kind of stock photo image of England in its green fields. And I was kind of doing the same. Oh, it looks so Japanese. So I had a tour of the temple, which is really beautiful. And I was thinking anyway about the role of silence in A Tale for the Time Being. What I asked about the different types of meditation, and within Zen, apparently there are 2 main types. In one, you meditate on these riddles known as koans, and the most famous is what's the sound of one hand clapping. People may have heard this one. So the idea is this kind of unanswerable riddle sort of propels your mind out of its usual conceptual frameworks. And the other is the idea of stilling or kind of emptying the mind. Now, apparently these used to be combined more, but they become a bit more separated as the Zen has sort of split into 2 different groups. And it's the stilling the mind that's more practiced at Sojiji. And obviously there's sections of A Tale for the Time Being where Now is learning to practice Zen meditation. Now, as I mentioned, I'm focusing very much on dialogue. We have this diary that makes its way across the Pacific, and the act of reading is a way of trying to understand, for people in British Columbia, the experiences of a teenage girl in this different culture. But I think the novel also makes a case for the value of silence as a kind of self-reflection. And we might be tempted to think of silence as like the opposite of dialogue, possibly even the negation of dialogue. But I think in A Tale for the Time Being, it's actually complementary, because there's a kind of stillness. It's associated in Zen meditation with, stillness of body and stillness of mind, as this becomes now superpower. And, relating to this, to the history that the novel goes into, which is the history of the war, her Haruki number one, her great uncle, is a kamikaze pilot. So there's a case for silence as a form of stillness that is also non-violent. And she says, she's sitting zazen. She's also learning not to swat at the mosquitoes. And by extension, we could take this to mean, well, by being stiller, do we also learn not to retaliate in both, or in either physical or verbal violence to the things that are happening to us? But I think it's not a negation of dialogue, and I think the sort of heroic gestures on the parts of Haruki number one and Haruki number two, which are heroic, non-violent gestures. These gestures could be kind of lost in silence without language, narrative to accompany them in the form of the diaries explaining what these gestures were, or the emails in the case of Nao's father. So I think what's interesting about the novel is, there's a complementary relationship between silence as a kind of stilling of the self and a non-violent act, which goes hand in hand with narrative in a very productive way in certain cases. There's also, I think, the idea of a kind of dialogue with the self through silence. At one point, Jiko asks Nao if she's angry about everything that's happened to her, and Nao replies, yeah, of course. And Jiko's response is like, I know that, and I didn't need to ask. So when Nao asks, well, so why did you ask? Jiko's response is, well, I asked so that you could hear your own answer. So, a lot of the time in dialogue, we're talking but not really listening. And I think what we get here is a more considered dialogue within the framework of a more general silence, wherein Jiko enables Nao to look at herself and reflect upon herself in a calm and more measured way. So those were my the main events I was involved in Tsurumi, and some of my thoughts that I tried to put into both the teaching and the presentation about A Tale for the Time Being. It was, I asked Jareen about the reception of the novel. She gave her own responses. I think my impression was that, the people who'd read it, or some had started to read it as a result of, me going there to talk about it. The responses were very positive. I think people considered it to be very, very enjoyable read, while at the same time addressing some of the darker aspects of Japanese history that, people feel they need to recognize and face up to, and also some of the less pleasant aspects of contemporary culture, the ijime, the bullying that now undergoes. I was having conversations where people say, this does actually happen. So, I think it was viewed by the people I spoke to as a really sort of constructive, readable, and well-considered fiction that allows people to approach and, I just mentioned kind of turning inward, while kind of reflect on contemporary culture in a more general sense as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this extra, bonus episode on A Tale for the Time Being. If any of you have read it, I'd be very interested to let you know, to hear your thoughts on things I've just said. And if you'd like to leave a comment, please do so. Thanks for listening.